In the Republican debates last night in Detroit, the allegation was made that Detroit had declined precipitously because of an overapplication of liberal ideas. The history records, however, that the decline of Detroit really had nothing particularly to do with ideology. It had to do with economic decisions uh, and a lack thereof. Let's start in the 50s. In the 50s, Detroit was on top of the world. Perhaps 90% of the cars produced in the world were made in Detroit. And the underlying assumption was made by the main automobile manufacturers that this would remain, that they would stay on top. And so they didn't take the time to see the possible threat on the horizon that might be coming their way. And in fact, eventually got into planned obsolescence, where cars were designed so that they would fall apart within 3 to 5 years so that you would need to buy a new one. There wasn't good quality within those cars. While this was taking place in Japan, William Deming was leading Japan from the ashes literally to eventually becoming the second most important industrial powerhouse in the world. And what was he doing? He was talking about quality control, talking about that you really need to pay attention to things like just-in-time manufacturing, that you had to look at future global markets and how to access them. And his statistical quality control system was adopted there enthusiastically in the 50s. So by the 1980s, Japan was producing the best quality cars. You could count on them. In Japan in the 50s, I remember, if you bought something in Japan, you knew it was junk, but it was cheap. But by the 80s, that was no longer true. They had quality circles, they had taken care of reducing frequency of repair, a better resale value in their cars. And so what happened to Detroit was that the Japanese adopted those methods and made them work and made much better cars, while Detroit continued on the path that it was taking. It wasn't until the 80s that Detroit woke up and began to dissect what the Japanese were doing. But by then, the market share had already plummeted. And in a number of ways, Detroit never really recovered from that. During this time period, one of the key governors of Michigan was George Romney, a good, solid conservative who had been president of American Motors. Well, American Motors no longer exists. I can remember my dad especially liked to buy those cars. My first car was a Rambler. But they've disappeared from the market because they didn't adopt these principles. So the real problems with Detroit really didn't have anything to do with ideology. George Romney, I'm sure, was a good governor, but he didn't see this coming either. And while he was governor, you had the horrible race riots across the country after Martin Luther King's in 1968. In a number of ways, Detroit never really recovered from that, nor did Baltimore. So there are a combination of factors here that have led to Detroit's decline, having, as I said, more to do with William Deming's and Japanese acceptance of quality controls. Add to that the impact of Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, in his research, showed that a particular car was, as he put it, Detroit made, unsafe at any speed. And it turned out to be correct. With the impact of that, Detroit also suffered. and never regained its prominence. So those are your main factors behind Detroit's demise and decline, not application or misapplication of a particular type of political ideology.